taking a moment to read that whole story. So oftentimes we pick small verses out of a much larger story, but when we remember the stories themselves will give us a lifetime of lessons. This morning, Jesus is giving all of us, including his own disciples, a lesson about how to face death together. It's a lesson the disciples are going to need to hear pretty soon as we move towards Easter in just 2 weeks. The Passion begins. But this isn't a story about just grief or loss. This is a story that's inviting us to do something really special. And so I need you to say something with me. I'm going to say throughout the sermon, unbind him. Can you please say that with me? Unbind him. Okay, one more time. Unbind him. This is really, really important. This is the one thing the people are asked to do in this story. The only thing. And so we're going to start with a context. You see, Jesus has been with Mary and Martha and Lazarus many times. He stayed at the house. He knows them. The scripture goes on and on to say how much Jesus loved this man. And so suddenly, the man Jesus, the prophet, the healer who has been across the world and country and just touching people and healing them and doing all sorts of miracles, doesn't show up when he's called. And this is hard. This is hard for the people that have heard I love you. This is hard for the people that know they have been loved, that have felt that love. And then suddenly Jesus doesn't show up like they expect, and they struggle. But before that, we have to talk about some disciples, right? You see, Jesus is probably out at Capernaum where he liked to hang out. And while he was there, him and his disciples were teaching and studying and praying and healing and talking and laughing and probably playing with kids. They did it daily. When he decides he's going to get up and go to see his friend Lazarus, who has died. The very first act of facing death in the story is when Jesus is facing his own death to go and help someone, and his disciples decide to face it with him. You see, Jesus was just down at Bethany, and they tried to stone him to death. He had to run for his life, and the Spirit of God protected him as he escaped from the Pharisees that tried to stone him for saying that he was the Son of God, the Messiah. And the disciples are trying to stop him, but when they realize they can't, doubting Thomas, the one who refuses after Easter to believe that Christ is risen. His heart is so broken that he can't accept the glory of the promise of Easter. That doubting Thomas is the one that stands up and encourages all the other disciples to say, if Jesus is going to go face death, we're going to face it with him. He rallies his friends to go and face not only the death of their friend, but what their own seemingly demise is going to be at the hand of the Pharisees. There's a lesson in there not to let people face the hard things alone. And so I need you all to say, unbind him. Because we need to be unbound from our fears at times. The fears that stop us from lending aid and help to others in need. From going to those places we know trouble might await, but the need and loud voice of God is calling us to go. But as they go there, the next part of the story unfolds, because just as they are facing death, they're also facing grief. At the outskirts of the city, the grief is so much that Martha meets Jesus out there. She's been waiting and longing for him. And she cries and she pours out her grief upon him. And Jesus doesn't say your grief is silly. He stands in it with her and makes a promise that he is true even in the grief, even in the storms. And he waits still as she runs and gets her other sister to come running out. And I'm so glad I serve a God that would wait and stand in grief with Mary Martha and all of Lazarus' neighbors and friends, as they all follow her and find Jesus on the outskirts of the city. And he is so moved. Yeah, I want you to hear it. The Son of God, the heart of God, is so moved by the grief of those he loves that he weeps with them. Fully knowing what's going to happen, he takes the moment to just weep and mourn with them so that they know their grief is valid, they know that they are not alone, and that they know they are loved enough that someone's going to sit with them in the pain. This is another lesson we need to learn. And so I want you to hear the voice of Jesus calling out again, and let's say it together. Unbind him. We get bound up in our ability to make everything okay again, to be hurried along into the joy and out of the grief. Sometimes grief is not a reflection of a lack of trust or of doubt or even not knowing what's going to happen or what has happened. It's just because we love, and we've loved so much, our heart is never the same. I have sat with so many people who are told, you need to stop crying now, it's been long enough. Jesus doesn't utter these words. Instead, Jesus stands and grieves and weeps with those in this world who are hurting. But now comes the fun part. Because just as we are confronting death in this story, just as we are standing in grief in this story, we are unbinding life in this story. Because you see, it doesn't just stop there. They continue on to the cave. And they roll the stone away, and as you heard the great voice of Jesus this morning, Lazarus, come out. We often like to picture it like the mummy, someone walking out of their own, Lazarus was bound, his feet bound together, his hands bound together, his head wrapped so tightly in cloth he would not have been able to breathe, and yet completely bound. He still comes out of the cave because he must respond when the Lord calls. And when he is there, unable to speak or breathe or barely move, Jesus gives a command to the friends, the neighbors, the family, the loved ones, those who are mourning, those who are grieving, those who came out and are waiting to see what he will do. And he says, unbind him. That is what we have been called to do. We have been called to go forward and unwrap Lazarus in this world. Because did you know, science has proven that even though Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, he was so tightly bound in the grave clothes, he would have died again within minutes. The stench of death, the lack of oxygen, the constricting force of the bindings. Someone's got to untie Lazarus even after he's been brought back from the darkness of the grave, of death, of despair. And so Jesus doesn't do it himself. He calls for the community that loves Lazarus to reach out and unbind him. And before we go into what that means for us today, I want to tell you about someone we celebrated this week and what it meant for him. Who has heard of St. Patrick? Everyone likes green? This is, you got to see the cute picture coming up. Yeah. But this is an actor replaying St. Patrick on his journey back to Ireland, in which he helps share the love of God and bring a whole nation into the faith. But his story starts when he was 16 years old, and he was bound up by being kidnapped and brought into slavery, where he served for years. His physical body was not bound, but he was bound within a country, within a system that would not let him go. And he was forced to be a shepherd in empty fields. And so he prayed without ceasing for years. And one day, he hears the voice of God say, a way out is coming. It's like Jesus at the tomb saying, Lazarus, come out. And so this young man who has been bound bound in the captivity and death of slavery for years, walks 200 miles to a shore where he finds a boat and a captain to take him home. And the captain says, "No, I won't." We don't like that part. But St. Patrick prays. And before he's even done praying, the captain has had a change of heart. The captain decides to risk himself, his ship, his sailors, his enterprise, his business, whatever has brought him to the land. He has decided to risk it all to help unbind this poor young man trapped in slavery. It's like suddenly the captain has heard the voice of Jesus saying, "Unbind him." And so he receives Patrick on his boat, brings him back home to his land, where Patrick gives himself over to God to serve for years and years. But even though Patrick is no longer bound by slavery, there are some things that sit with a man, or a woman, or a child. Memories, pain, longing, grief, the loss, the guilt, all of it. Maybe even the anger, the jealousy, the vengeance, the rage. And one day, Patrick feels the need to be unbound. And so he returns to Ireland. He can't help but go because the very people that bound him need to be untied. They need to be set free in the same life that he has known. He is unbound from his slavery, unbound from grief and rage and loss and guilt and any other complex emotion. And he goes to set free those that captured him, enslaved him, isolated him. There's a role to play for the community of God. We have been called to do one thing in this story, and you can say it with me one more time: unbind him. And when we ourselves become untied, it's also appropriate for us to untie others, just as St. Patrick did, just as Lazarus did. Because the truth of this day is we are held in the clutches of death and darkness even when we've been brought to life. Even when any person has ever accepted and found new life in Jesus, there are still bonds and binds and chains and grave clothes wrapped around them. They could look like drugs. They could look like guilt. They could look like doubt. They could look like death. They could look like grief or anger. They could look like the inability to forgive or be accepted. I remember when I finally was able to stop hating myself for the things I did. I was free. People have been loving me for years, but I had never been able to forgive myself. Who here has heard the words, "You have been forgiven," and yet not forgiven themselves? Anyone? Sometimes it takes a community to unbind you because you can't do it yourself. It takes a community to say, "You are loved, you are loved, you are needed, you are wanted, you are ours, we care for you." And so as the community, as the neighbors, as the friends, as the family, whatever you're going through, I believe the work of God in you, and I'm going to help unbind you from it. Because those things that held us in darkness and death, even as we walked as the living dead in this world, will reach back out and try to pull us back in. There is always something that is trying to take you back into the person you used to be. There's always a temptation. There's always a place of darkness that you can't let go of, and it takes someone else to say, "You are loved enough that you don't have to stay there anymore. And I'm going to help you believe it with my words, my actions, and my presence. I'm going to unbind you." So next time you know of someone that's trying to get out of whatever they're in, next time you hear of a story of someone that has been caged in a life of death for decades and are trying to take a step out, unbind them. And if you are there yourself, hear God calling to the community around you. They are going to help unbind you. Because we all All wear invisible chains of our own making. And sometimes it takes the life of God bursting up in us to bring us to life and awareness of them. And then it takes the words and call of God, the action of the church, the people, the body, the community, to surround someone with so much love. The chains are broken, the ties are unbound, and new life is given. Who looks like they're having more fun? The person who is doing the unbinding. Let's go out and share the life we know. Share the life of freedom we know we can offer to others. Let's go out in the call of Jesus and unbind them all from anything and everything that God has called them to life out of. Out of the grave, out of the clothes, out of the darkness. Let's set some people free. Amen.